We often hear these, simple explanations for why some countries are rich and others are struggling, right?
Yeah,
But you probably sense, like I do, that there's a much bigger, um, more complicated story behind it all.
definitely.
Today, we're going way beyond the surface. We're diving deep into the history and the systems that have actually created the global inequalities we see.
Exactly. And we're going to explore how historical exploitation and ongoing economic practices really contribute to this situation, where some nations are described as underdeveloped,
Right.
while within other countries, even wealthy ones, we see these huge gaps between the rich and, well, everyone else.
And the material we're looking at today gives us some really powerful examples, doesn't it, from how entire continents were just carved out.
Yeah, to the nuts and bolts of how modern economies work or maybe don't work for everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Our goal really is to look past just individual stories and understand the larger forces at play.
So by the end, you should have a much clearer picture of these deeply rooted patterns.
Hopefully, yeah.
Okay, so where should we start? Africa seems like a really stark example.
It really is.
One of the most powerful illustrations of how past decisions still have massive consequences today comes from the Berlin Conference. That was 1884, 1885.
Right.
Now, picture this. A bunch of European countries sitting around a table, and this is key,
Yeah.
with no one from Africa even in the room.
Not a single representative.
And they're deciding how to split up the entire continent amongst themselves.
The sheer presumption of it is just astonishing. They literally took maps and drew lines, straight lines often.
Just drew lines on a map.
Yeah, completely ignoring the existing, patchwork of tribal lands, different languages, long-standing cultural groups, everything that was actually there on the ground.
And the research really emphasizes how this arbitrary drawing of borders, it's been a major cause of ongoing instability in the region, hasn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Think about it. Suddenly you have communities that maybe lived together peacefully for centuries. Now they're ripped apart by a new border.
Or the opposite.
Or, yeah, groups with a history of conflict suddenly forced together inside these new artificial states.
It's almost like setting the stage for future problems right from the very start.
Exactly. And as our sources highlight, the result, after these countries eventually gained independence,
Yeah.
many were left with these deeply divided societies, which led to internal conflicts, weak governments,
It's making them vulnerable.
making them much more vulnerable to outside forces wanting their resources. Yeah. It's like Europe redrew Africa's map with a ruler, basically.
Ignoring centuries of how people actually lived.
Yeah.
And those consequences are still echoing today.
They really are. If you look at the bigger picture, these artificial borders created vulnerabilities that have just lasted for generations.
Can you describe that difference, like the before and after maps?
Well, imagine the map of Africa before colonization. It's this complex mix, hundreds of different tribes, peoples, each with their own territories, often defined by natural boundaries, rivers, mountains, fluid regions.
Makes sense.
Then compare that to the map after the Berlin Conference. These stark, straight lines, really bizarre shapes sometimes, that have zero connection to culture or geography. It fundamentally broke apart existing social structure.
It really hits you when you see those maps side by side. It's shocking.
It is.
And this kind of top-down restructuring wasn't unique to Africa, was it?
No, not at all.
Our sources then take us to India under British rule, and this is where we really see this idea of a systematic drain of wealth.
Right. And it's important to remember, before the British arrived, India was actually a very prosperous place, a major player in the global economy.
But British rule wasn't just about political control, was it?
No, it was much more than that. It was a deliberate, organized removal of wealth. The research details how the British Raj actively undermined India's own industries.
How did they do that?
Well, for example, they essentially banned the production of certain Indian textiles, high-quality textiles that were world-renowned.
So Indians couldn't make their own cloth.
Effectively, yeah. Or they faced huge barriers. They were forced, often, to buy more expensive cloth made back in Britain. Think of it like Britain saying, okay, you can grow the cotton.
But you can't turn it into clothes.
Exactly. We'll do that part, and then we'll sell it back to you at a higher price.
Wow. That's a completely one-sided arrangement.
Totally. And it gets even worse when you look at the famines.
Oh, yeah. The sources mention this.
Our sources explain how the British changed farming policies. They prioritized crops that could be exported back to Britain, cash crops.
Instead of food for local people.
Right. Often ignoring the need to grow food for the local population. And this, combined with other factors, led to these horrific widespread famines, massive loss of life.
And this ties into that drain of wealth idea.
Precisely. This is where Dadabhai Naoroji's concept is so significant. He argued it wasn't just normal trade, it was a systematic flow of resources, raw materials, finished goods, actual money being taken from India to Britain.
Without anything of equal value coming back.
Exactly. It enriched Britain directly, but at the expense of India.
The numbers you mentioned earlier are staggering.
They really are. Our sources show that at the start of colonization, India's share of the world's economy, its GDP, was around 23%. Huge.
22%. Okay.
By the time the British finally left in 1947, it had plummeted to just 3%.
3%. That's not just a decline, that's economic devastation.
Complete devastation. It raises a really important question, doesn't it? How do these historical patterns of exploitation continue? How do they play out in different ways today?
Yeah, because it's not all ancient history.
No. And our sources give us some compelling insights, actually, even within a wealthy country like the United States, when we look at wealth inequality and the role of education.
Okay, so we've seen how historical actions created instability in Africa, drained wealth from India. How do similar systemic forces operate, say, within the U.S.?
Well, one key example highlighted is how public schools are funded in the U.S.
Right, it's mostly through local property taxes.
Exactly, and that immediately creates a very uneven playing field. Wealthier neighborhoods, they have higher property values, so they can afford to fund excellent schools. Great resources, smaller classes, you name it.
While poorer neighborhoods,
Poorer neighborhoods, often where minority communities live, they have lower property values, so their schools end up underfunded, lacking basic resources sometimes.
and this creates a cycle, right?
That's what's fascinating, or maybe disturbing. It creates this cycle that just keeps going. Kids in richer areas get a good education, which, generally helps them get better jobs or more money.
So they can stay in those wealthy areas.
Right, and fund good schools for their own kids. But on the other hand, kids in poorer areas often get a lower quality education. That limits their opportunities, often trapping them in lower paying jobs. Makes it really hard to move out to break the cycle.
And the sources we looked at, they don't shy away from suggesting this isn't just like an accident.
No, there's an argument presented that this system is, in a way, designed to maintain this inequality.
Designed? How so?
Well, the thinking goes, if a large portion of the population, the working class, is really well educated and financially secure, they might start demanding better wages, better working conditions.
Things that could challenge the status quo.
Exactly. Things that could threaten the wealth and power of those already at the top. So keeping education unequal helps maintain that workforce dynamic.
That's a powerful argument.
And if we connect this back to the bigger picture, the global inequality picture, we see similar things happening on an international level. Even after countries became politically independent, many poorer nations find themselves trapped. Trapped in debt, trapped in what some people call neocolonialism.
Neocolonialism. So like colonialism, but without the direct political rule.
Kind of. Often through the influence of powerful international organizations like the IMF and the World Bank. These patterns of creating and maintaining inequality, they aren't just relics of historical colonialism. We see similar dynamics now.
How does that work with the IMF and World Bank?
Well, our sources explain how these institutions often provide loans to developing countries. Which sounds good, right? They need the money.
There's a catch.
There's usually a catch. These loans often come with pretty strict conditions attached. Structural adjustment programs, they're often called.
Like what kind of conditions?
Things like cutting back on government spending on social programs, education, healthcare, selling off state-owned industries, often to private, sometimes foreign companies.
It's privatization.
Yeah, and opening up their economies to foreign corporations, reducing trade barriers.
So imagine needing a loan desperately and then being forced to agree to rules that might end up benefiting foreign companies more than your own people or local businesses.
That's essentially the dynamic described. It's a modern form of influence, of control, without needing armies or governors. Economic leverage.
And what's the long-term impact of these conditions?
Well, the argument is that while they're often presented as necessary for, like, fiscal responsibility or economic stability,
They can actually hold countries back.
They can actually prevent a country from investing in its own people, in its own future, from building a strong, independent economy. It can keep them dependent on outside forces, vulnerable to, well, further exploitation by wealthy corporations.
Do the sources give an example?
Yeah, they mentioned Ghana, took loans from the IMF, and then had to make significant cuts to essential services, education, and healthcare to meet the loan requirement.
Which obviously hurts the population directly.
Absolutely. It has a direct negative impact on people's well-being, their future opportunities. It can essentially lock them into a state of economic hardship.
So this all leads back to the fundamental way inequality is maintained, right? This cycle.
Exactly. That's the core mechanism our sources describe. It's a cycle. Poor education leads to limited job opportunities.
Which means less income probably leads to poorer health outcomes.
Right. Poorer healthcare access, less political power or influence.
And it all just perpetuates itself, keeping wealth concentrated at the top.
And as our sources emphasize, there's a real element of control here. Control over what people learn, what they can earn, how they live, and sometimes, sadly, even how long they live.
And all this exists alongside that constant message we hear, oh, you just need to work harder.
Right. Which completely ignores these huge systemic obstacles that so many people face. It puts all the blame or credit on the individual.
When the reality is much bigger.
Exactly. The economic struggles, the lack of development we see in some parts of the world. It isn't because of some inherent failing of the people living there. The research is very clear on this.
That's the history.
It is overwhelmingly a result of centuries of historical exploitation, colonialism, slavery, and then these ongoing forms of economic manipulation.
Let's unpack that historical wealth accumulation a bit more. You mentioned European powers.
Yeah, think about it. The vast wealth that countries like Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, Belgium, the Netherlands accumulated over centuries. It didn't just, appear out of thin air.
Where did it come from?
It was directly fueled by the theft of resources from colonized lands. Gold, diamonds, timber, rubber.
And labor.
And the brutal exploitation of forced labor, most horrifically through the transatlantic slave trade. Plus, trade agreements that were deliberately rigged in their favor.
And even the infrastructure they built in these colonies.
That's another key point our sources make. The railroads, the ports, they weren't primarily built to benefit the local people, to connect local markets.
They were built to get resources out.
Exactly. They were designed to make it faster and easier to extract valuable resources, minerals, crops, and ship them back to the colonizing countries. Extraction infrastructure.
The example of Haiti you mentioned earlier is just mind-blowing.
It's particularly jarring, isn't it? Here's a nation, the first free Black republic, born from a successful slave revolt against France. They fought for and won their independence.
An incredible achievement.
Incredible. Only to be then forced by France, under threat of invasion, to pay massive amounts of money, reparations, they called it.
Reparations to France.
For what? For the loss of property the slaves who had freed themselves. France demanded compensation from the formerly enslaved people for the loss of their value as property.
That's obscene.
It is. And this crippling debt, which Haiti was paying off for over a century, basically strangled its economy from the very beginning. The long-term consequences have been devastating.
So this historical exploitation directly links to modern poverty and debt.
Directly. And this connects to something else our sources discuss, the structural advantage for those at the top of having a large pool of people who are desperate, who are struggling to survive.
How is that an advantage?
Well, when people are focused purely on meeting their basic needs, food, shelter, just getting by day to day, they're much less likely to have the time, the energy, or the resources to organize, to protest, to demand bigger systemic changes.
They're too busy surviving to fight the system.
In essence, yes. It
Yep.
keeps the workforce pliable, potentially keeps wages down.
And this is why the discussion around things like universal access to education, healthcare, housing is so absolutely critical.
It really is. Our sources argue that if these fundamental needs were actually met for everyone, truly met,
It would empower people.
it would give more people the foundation, the knowledge from education, the health, the basic security to actually challenge the existing power structures, to challenge the concentration of wealth.
And those underfunded schools we talked about in the U.S.?
Funded by those inadequate property taxes in low-income areas. They're a really clear contemporary example of this principle in action.
How so?
It's a system that, maybe not with explicit stated intent, but certainly in its effect, limits the potential, the upward mobility of a large segment of the population. It maintains that unequal playing field.
And the idea of equality itself? The sources suggest it's often just talk.
Well, the point made is that genuine equality, true equality, would require a fundamental shift, a redistribution of wealth, of land, of capital, of influence.
Things that those who currently hold that power are unlikely to give up willingly.
History suggests they rarely do. So often, the rhetoric of equality isn't matched by actions that would actually achieve it.
So wrapping this up, the key takeaway seems to be, this isn't random.
Not at all. The key takeaway from our sources is that the patterns of poverty and inequality we see, both around the world and within countries, they aren't accidents. They are, in large part, a direct result of historical and economic systems working exactly the way they were designed or how they evolved to work.
And that point about survival.
Yeah, when people are just trying to survive day to day, they simply don't have the capacity, the time, the energy, the resources to effectively push for the kind of fundamental change that might be needed. The system, in a way, protects itself.
So as we finish this deep dive, I really hope you, listening, have a much clearer understanding now, a clearer sense of these deep connections between historical injustices and the economic realities we see all around us today.
Yeah. We've looked at how decisions made long ago, sometimes centuries ago, continue to shape borders, economies, opportunities, and how current systems can actively keep these inequalities going.
You've now had the chance, hopefully, to really examine some of the systemic forces at work, maybe getting beyond those simple explanations we started with.
All right. And this leads to a final, maybe provocative, but really important thought to leave you with.
Okay.
If these systems, with all their built-in biases, all their historical baggage, if they were built by humans, constructed over time,
Fine.
doesn't it follow that they can also be dismantled, that they can be rebuilt intentionally in a way that is more just, more equitable?
So the question becomes, can we change them?
Maybe think about your own place in this complex picture. And based on this deeper understanding of where these inequalities come from, what possibilities for change might actually exist? Something to consider.